Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the Heat Beneath Our Feet webinar, a webinar series that will accompany this year's WGA Chairman Initiative, selected by Colorado Governor Polis to explore the development and deployment of geothermal energy. My name is Stephen Emmon. I'm a policy advisor for Western Governors Association. Now, if you had asked me about geothermal energy not too long ago, I most likely would have brought up how geothermal systems can melt the ice off of my driveway. While that's a cool application, innovation and breakthroughs in recent years have shown us possibilities of many more applications. Applications like energy storage, mineral extraction, direct air capture, and hydrogen production. We're joined today to discuss some of these great applications by two amazing guests, Sarah Jewett, VP of Strategy for Fervo Energy, and Keith Malone, Public Affairs for the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Partnership. Before moving forward, I'd like to take a moment to recognize our sponsors who are listed at the beginning of this webinar. Without their support, our work on this initiative would not be possible. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Also, if you'd like to see anything that was said during this webinar or any of the presentations that you'll see today, WGA will be putting a recording of this webinar up on our website. Now, to start off our presentations today, I'll be handing the mic over to Sarah Jewett with Fervo Energy to discuss some of the amazing applications they're currently looking into. Sarah, could you tell us a little bit more about Fervo Energy and the different applications that you guys are exploring for geothermal systems?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for the intro, Steve. Thank you all for coming to this webinar. Very excited to hopefully field some interesting Q&A on geothermal energy storage applications and hear Keith talk about hydrogen and geothermal together, which is incredibly high potential. Also would love to thank the Western Governors Association for focusing on geothermal. Geothermal is not a new technology. It is something that's been around for quite some time, but the enhanced focus on geothermal energy, I think, is really, really key for working on deep decarbonization currently in the United States and energy security. So many thanks to Governor Polis for selecting geothermal as his focus for this year. It's been fun to work with you all and really looking forward to continuing the conversation moving forward. Fervo Energy has been around for about 5 years. We are a company focused on large-scale electricity generation from geothermal energy in the Western United States. I like to clarify that because there are a lot of different kinds of geothermal energy, and Steve, you're not alone thinking about the geothermal energy that could melt your driveway and make it so you don't have to go shovel snow. We are working on sort of the largest scale capacity of geothermal, which is trying to generate lots of electrons to put on the grid to disperse via transmission and power people's homes everywhere. But deep direct use geothermal, which is using geothermal heat directly, and then also residential heating and cooling by geothermal, are also both highly compelling applications of the heat beneath our feet. So Fervo Energy is focused mostly on the Western United States. We are applying a geothermal anywhere approach. And what that means is we are using proven technology from the oil and gas industry, such as horizontal drilling, multi-stage well completion, and fiber optic monitoring to produce more predictable geothermal systems in less geographically constrained areas than historically was possible. We are working today on a few projects in Nevada and Utah and have a couple of offtake agreements signed with load-serving entities in California. I'm happy to dive in and talk directly about geothermal energy storage or talk more about Fervo, whatever is best for you, Steve.
Yeah, I know you had a couple slides to share, Sarah, if you wanted to jump into geothermal energy storage. I think that's an application a lot of people wanted to hear some more about.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share a presentation that I have put together for this. And we're going to start with a little bit of macro. Let's see. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Start talking about a little bit of the macro environment for why it is that we're talking about energy storage for geothermal applications. Some of you may know this better than others, but the need for reliability is something that's drastically evolving before my very eyes. I've been in the geothermal energy industry for about 2.5 years at this point in time. And I would say the way people are thinking about grid reliability in that time is actually changing very, very quickly. So peak reliability demand is actually moving from a summer net peak to what's called a winter renewable drought. I think when you look at this graph that I've put up here, on the x-axis, you see renewable energy penetration from 0 to 100% increasing towards the right. And on the y-axis, you see drivers of reliability need. And so it used to be in low areas of renewable energy penetration that the hottest hour of the year was when you had summer, when you had peak demand for reliability because people are turning on their air conditioning units and trying to cool off their houses during the summer. And so the peak need was during the hot hours of the summer. I think what you've seen as renewable penetration has increased and solar energy has come on is that peak reliability comes in the summer net peak. And what that means is when solar energy is sort of coming off and is no longer capable of providing electricity, that's when the greatest area of reliability is needed. What you see when we really go to an extreme, that's sort of where we're considered to be today. And I think when you go to a much greater version of renewable energy penetration, so this is tons of wind, tons of solar plus battery, and even baseload resources like geothermal energy, what you see is actually the peak reliability is moving to a really strange hour of the year, which is sort of like a really cold morning in the winter. And part of this is that lots of natural gas heating is switching to electric heating. Generally, load is increasing because of Electrify Everything. And this is actually from California Public Utilities Commission that they're starting to see this weird hour of an early cold morning in the winter is when they're going to need the most reliability. So unless you have something that can sort of come on when it gets really, really cold on a January morning, you are going to be in a place where you're more inclined to put more fossil fuels on the grid than necessarily renewables. And I think this is where we see a lot of driver, not only for firm clean power, which is what we're working on in geothermal energy, but you see the need for something that sort of looks like a natural gas peaking asset for when it gets really cold and it's really dark. This is something that, when the CPUC came out with it, Fervo was really excited to see it. So I just wanted to share it here as sort of the basis for conversation. In addition to that, there are some really interesting policy drivers that make you realize that lots of states are moving in that direction of high renewable penetration. This is just a selection of renewable portfolio standards and greenhouse gas emissions across a few Western United States that show that the market for firm and dispatchable clean energy is actually going to be here before we know it. We're seeing great pressure from that in California, but I think Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Washington are just a few that are actually close behind California on the need for both firm and dispatchable clean energy. I think last time I checked, there were something like over 35 states actually had a renewable portfolio standard. So it's not just the states that I've listed here. So the point of this is that there are substantive binding targets that are driving really massive demand for what geothermal can offer, especially if it has a dispatchable function. All right, let's get into it. So dispatchable geothermal energy already exists. Many thanks to Ormat. Ormat's 8 megawatt Puna expansion facility in Hawaii was actually the world's first fully dispatchable geothermal power plant. This plant actually adjusts its power output quickly in response to a requested ramp rate from the grid and then is able to maintain frequency. And they've done it in an interesting way on the surface components, which is they actually maintain the geothermal fluid flow in the reservoir at a relatively steady rate. And then they provide dispatchability through a bypass in the generation equipment. So when electricity is needed, they basically flip the bypass and they produce electricity from the geothermal brine. And when it's not needed, they open the bypass and the geothermal fluid goes straight in without extracting any enthalpy from it before it is re-injected. So I just wanted to lay the groundwork here and not say that dispatchable geothermal is an entirely new concept because it's something that Ormat has already managed to do today. Now, the big question is, what is Fervo doing that sort of takes this a step further? And the question is, can we actually, rather than extracting any enthalpy from the reservoir, pulling it up, and then just choosing not to use it, can we actually do something to choke off the reservoir so that we're storing that energy in the reservoir and we never harvest it in the first place? This has historically not been sort of the method of choice, and that's because it's hard to ramp geothermal flow rates, and there are some things that choking off production could have from a negative impact perspective on long-term reservoir fluid management. That said, Fervo is working hand in hand with Princeton's Net Zero Lab to see if we can actually model a system that could work in this capacity. So Fervo Flex is Fervo's trademarked long-duration energy storage and load-following geothermal generation solution. How does it work? Well, you can see down here on the bottom, this red diagram. Fervo is planning to produce something like a doublet or a triplet well system. This is a triplet well system, meaning there are 3 horizontal wells with a multi-stage completion between them, such that water is coming down this injection well on the right. That's cold water. It's running through the reservoir, through all these various cracks, and it's coming up the production wells as hot water. So what ends up happening with the Fervo Flex in reservoir energy storage is that we actually continue to inject fluid. We never stop injecting at any point. But what we choke off is actually the production part of our system. And so you can sort of think about it as, this is a very simplistic and non-technical, but you can sort of think about it as you continue to pump into a reservoir, but you choke the effluent so that you end up sort of swelling the system. And as you swell that system, energy is stored such that when you open the production wells, the reservoir that has sort of been charged releases a lot of hot fluid, and you actually have, a little bit of an overproduction of energy from, your typical net generation rate. And so this is sort of the basic concept of Fervo's in-reservoir energy storage. And it's something that we've spent a ton of time modeling and have started to test in the field. As you may have gathered, it is not something that takes a ton of engagement from the power generation side of things. I mean, there are a few modifications that must be added to a power facility to be able to produce sort of inconsistently, but generally ours is a subsurface approach. What's cool about this, from an energy storage perspective, I think when you think about geothermal energy as a 24/7 generating resource that can be fully dispatchable to load follow with a fast ramp and multi-day energy storage capabilities with large-scale deployment potential, you see something that is extremely unique. So in this table, you have competing long-duration energy storage technologies, including lithium-ion, long-duration batteries, hydroelectric, nuclear. And I think what you see is that flexible geothermal, if it works in reservoir, can provide many different characteristics that many of the other long-duration energy storage technologies actually can't really compete with. It has 24/7 generation capability, so it can be run as a flat electricity source. It can be fully dispatchable, so you can sort of choke it off when you choose, when there is, not as much load on the grid, and then you can open the gates when there's more increased load, say in that early winter cold morning. In our modeling, we've showed that we can actually ramp up this system pretty quickly. And, also it has high capacity for energy storage. So we're talking about multiple megawatts and not just a kilowatt scale energy storage system. And then time to reach gigawatt scale deployment, I think Fervo has set out to basically develop a system that we could equip every single one of our geothermal power plants with, rather than something that is separate from our baseload facilities. And so because of that, it's sort of in the 5 to 10 years to, full gigawatt scale deployment realm, which is, Fervo believes that all of the momentum behind geothermal energy will really give the momentum to create this as a multi-gigawatt industry soon. So it's it's something that has a huge amount of potential, and I'm definitely happy to answer more questions about this as we go on. That was sort of brief and non-technical overview. I would ask that you keep your technical questions mostly high level, because I am not a scientist, but I can play one on TV, so I will try.
Sarah, thank you very much. And we have had a lot of questions already coming in. Now, I think you covered this a bit in your presentation, but I did want to ask and go through really quickly. A big question whenever we're talking about energy storage is how long can we store that energy for, and do we lose any of that energy? Do you know if that's something that's currently being researched in this area, or is this a pretty closed loop system? Or is it pretty efficient? What are you guys looking at when we're looking at efficiency and timeline of these energy storage systems?
We are looking at energy storage systems that could be multi-day storage. And so we have looked at 7 to 10 day energy storage. And I think the real potential is when you start exceeding 24 or 48 hour storage limits. And I think from our modeling, these systems have shown to be highly effective at multi-day storage. From a do you lose any energy to the reservoir perspective? That is a great question. And when lots of people think about geothermal energy, they think about highly fractured reservoirs, because traditional hydrothermal geothermal energy targets highly fractured reservoirs, and natural fractures sort of are used to convey fluid from injection to production well. And so when people think about pumping a lot of fluid into a geothermal energy reservoir, they say, okay, it's just going to dissipate through all these various natural fractures. What Fervo is actually looking to do is to develop in a much lower matrix permeability reservoir than traditional hydrothermal geothermal. And so the idea is basically outside of the system we've created, there is not actually a large potential for large scale fluid leak off. And if you think about that, you will lose some to the reservoir, and what we've modeled is about 80% efficiency. You will lose some to the reservoir over time as you continue to pump into the system, but there shouldn't be massive thief zones that sort of take all of the fluid that you're pumping into these low permeability reservoirs.
That's good information to know. And I'm going to assume that this could be coupled with other energy sources such as solar and wind. And that brings up my next question. Where is Fervo operating in the West? And where do you think is going to be kind of the top places that we might see some of these technologies deployed?
Fervo is really operating in the big high potential geothermal reservoir states in the West right now. So the majority of our acreage positions are in Nevada and Utah. We also are highly focused on California, Idaho, New Mexico, Oregon, the states that surround where we are, as well as Colorado. And so that's there is really good temperature at depth underneath all those Western states, just by fact of the way the geology has formed over time. I think when you think about where you can put energy storage, you can actually put it in any of these places. And so we are really talking about the Western United States here. You mentioned coupling with wind and solar. There's a really interesting phenomenon in geothermal energy that is sort of counter and highly symbiotic with solar energy. Solar energy is doing really, really well when it's super hot and super sunny outside. That's sort of its highest efficiency peak. That's actually when geothermal energy is doing the worst. And that's because geothermal plants have to cool the fluid that is run through the organic Rankine cycle system. And that cooling relies on temperature differential between the fluid and the ambient air. Because of that, we actually do a lot better from an efficiency perspective when it's cold outside in the winter. And so, you've seen Ormat and a couple other operating geothermal energy companies start to use solar on their plants as a nice complement, because the solar will do super well right when, the geothermal plant is maybe struggling to maintain efficiency in the really hot hours of the summer.
Wonderful. Well, Sarah, thank you for that presentation. And as a reminder to our guests who are watching today, if you have a question, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of our screen. Please feel free to put a question in there. We will ask it at the end of the presentations towards the end of this webinar. Now, we'll be moving into an area that has been kind of surprising to me, and that's the area of hydrogen. Now, this came up about during a couple of our workshops that WGA has hosted around geothermal throughout the West, and the possibility for geothermal and hydrogen to coexist, and how it's a really, the intersection between those energy sources is a really unique one, and a possible application that is going to help with energy transition and that could be utilized by a lot of Western states. Today, joining us obviously is Keith Malone from the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Partnership. Keith, could you tell us a little bit more about the hydrogen sector and how it intersects with the geothermal sector and how they kind of benefit each other?
Sure, absolutely. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Let's get this started. Well, I can start off by saying, as I figure out how to get this thing moving, in the hydrogen community, not a lot is talked about when it comes to geothermal as an energy and renewable input. And I should back up and say, as part of my job, I'm a non-scientist. Steve, can you at least see the slides that I've got?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I apologize to everyone. At some point, I'll figure it out and someone will help me do this. But when we talk traditionally about hydrogen production, and more specifically, renewable hydrogen production, a lot of times the renewable energy inputs we're talking about tend to be solar and wind, and a lot of the other sources tend to be forgotten. And it's great to see that geothermal is stepping up and there's a greater interest in it, because I think it has a business case and an operational case that none of the others do. And obviously, as Sarah was talking about, I should note that the partnership, just to back up a little bit, we are a public-private partnership. We've been around since 1999. We focus primarily on hydrogen mobility. We've been working with a variety of stakeholders to synchronize the rollout of vehicles and hydrogen fueling infrastructure. And increasingly, it's becoming clear that we need to be synchronizing the rollout of hydrogen production along with these two other key pillars for mobility. And so I want to talk a little bit about the hydrogen production aspects and what are the key drivers that will make hydrogen production from geothermal a very interesting opportunity. On this slide, it's probably appropriate that I include at the bottom of the page a key foundational element that the Department of Energy has really focused one of its key earth shots on getting hydrogen production down to the cost of $1 per kilogram within the next decade, probably sometime in the early 2030s. But driving the policies that are really driving renewable hydrogen production include the hydrogen hub development that comes out of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was passed in late 2021. And we're talking about $9.5 billion for these various projects that also includes really pushing electrolyzer development and production. But what you have right now is about $8 billion. You have what was originally 79 applicants, which is now down to 33, a variety of private and state efforts. Sometimes they are a mix, sometimes they're independent of one another. On the right-hand side, I've included logos from various Western hydrogen hub efforts. WISH, which is a project, which is a combined hub application from New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. SHINE, which comes out of the Southwest, primarily Nevada and Arizona. The Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Hub, which includes Oregon and Washington. You have High Velocity, one of several efforts coming out of Texas. Hawaii has submitted an application, as well as other states, including the very bottom arches, which is out of California. This is really meant to drive production, and one of the key elements of this is really pairing it with who's going to use this hydrogen, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later. But one of the key policy elements that was passed last year comes out of the Inflation Reduction Act, and that is the hydrogen production tax credit. which has set things in motion, not only here, but globally. And I'll be referencing that a little bit. But hydrogen from geothermal is really well positioned under these conditions to shine in a way that it never has. And as I said, with this sort of global sort of perspective, for example, I often talk about as early as 3 to 5 years ago that the game is on internationally, that you have a variety of countries and regions, Japan, Europe, Canada, Africa, and others that are positioning themselves to be, and certainly the Middle East and North Africa, really positioning themselves for this sort of almost geoeconomic, geopolitical sort of positioning for hydrogen production and export. The Europeans have been incredibly aggressive in their language about hydrogen production and export. And in fact, the IRA really has lit a fire underneath them, as well as our Canadian colleagues as well. With the passage of the IRA, we're now beginning to see our European colleagues driving policy that matches that and kind of one-ups it. Obviously, recently, the summit between US, Canada, and Mexico focused on a number of things, including creating a North American green hydrogen market. But you're seeing it in all sorts of areas across the global landscape. And to pull it back a little bit to here in the North American West Coast, we recently had California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia further strengthening their policy initiatives, especially when it comes to mobility, which this slide is a little bit more focused on, but it certainly has implications for hydrogen overall. You're seeing these particular states and provinces with increasingly aligning policies, if not identical policies. And this certainly has implications across the Western US, because this just won't be, these states will not only be making a large amount of hydrogen, but some will be exporting it, some will be importing it. I can foresee California importing its hydrogen needs from other Western states that are nearby. As we already know, there are a lot of different ways to make hydrogen. There are a lot of inputs, both in terms of feedstock and in terms of energy. To the right, a lot of the traditional sources, some of those will go away as we further pursue low carbon and zero carbon initiatives. Moving towards the left, like I said, we're focused primarily in many of the discussions on solar and wind, oftentimes to the exclusion of other opportunities, especially geothermal. And the invitation to this webinar certainly made me start to think and kind of look at the unique aspects of geothermal that operate in a way that the closest thing I think you might get to it would be hydropower. And another slide here, kind of looking at to the left-hand side, a lot of the energy inputs, and to the right, a lot of the uses of hydrogen, especially those that we see today. A lot of this hydrogen today is used for petroleum refining, certainly for ammonia production, which becomes a really interesting hydrogen carrier, especially as we look at global exports and trading of it. And then above all of that, when we talk about fuel, not only for energy production, but also for mobility as well. And as I mentioned before, mobility becomes, especially in the Western US, because of the work we're seeing in California and now increasingly in Oregon and Washington and other states, mobility becomes this sort of rapidly scalable opportunity for using hydrogen. And one of the key aspects of the Hydrogen Hub funding is that they not only have to produce the hydrogen, they really have to create systems and opportunities where the hydrogen production is actually utilized by an industry or industries. And as you can see, for example, probably the biggest users of that hydrogen are going to be, like you can see in the lower right, it's going to be heavy duty trucking. Right above that, trains, a number of train projects are coming to the fore. towards the lower left, transit is going to be an absolutely key user of hydrogen, not just here, but across the country. And as I start to close out my part of the presentation, we are at the beginning of developing a national hydrogen mobility strategy that begins to look at, because heavy duty trucking really doesn't stop at state borders. It's a national sort of effort, so you cannot really develop a roadmap or a strategy document that looks at one state or several states. It really requires that we look at this sort of national, a national effort, and setting in place routes, or at least initial routes, that begin to connect up not only ports, commerce, hydrogen hubs, and you'll see in these sorts of green ovals and circles kind of imagine where we think some of these hub efforts might be. And so you'll be hearing more about that over the next year or two as we further work with a variety of stakeholders, and we're hoping to work with the Western Governors Association as we begin to pull people in and develop these sorts of discussions. And I wanted to reference something that, Steve, that you had shared with me last week as I prepared for this, this congressional research report. And one of the things I noted in blue was this sort of the use of hydrogen for excess, when we have excess power generation capacity. Certainly that is an opportunity for hydrogen to kind of take curtailed wind and solar. But I don't think that's the only, a lot of people talk about that almost exclusively, but really with geothermal's ability to provide continuous power, I think you're going to begin to see projects just like we're seeing now, particularly with solar to hydrogen projects, where these solar plants are devoted exclusively to hydrogen production. And that hydrogen production tax credit really becomes not just a driver, but an accelerator of interest for a lot of, I would think, geothermal interests in producing it. And then lastly, hydrogen becomes a unique opportunity for, as we talked about, energy storage, really long-term energy storage, as well as a means of transporting electrons that are created across distances where we may not have power lines. And I wanted to kind of highlight, obviously, from the most recent WGA webinar about Hawaii, really being able to take the geothermal energy that's produced on Hawaii and sharing it with other islands in the form of, and I would guess, given the shorter distances here, probably liquid hydrogen, maybe ammonia, but most likely I would think liquid hydrogen. In California, our North Coast, which is isolated in many ways, only two major highways really feeding it. You do have geothermal energy to the south in those red starred areas that I've included, as well as wind power to the north. In case of an earthquake or a tsunami or major wildfire, they are effectively cut off. So energy storage, and in particular long-term energy storage, becomes absolutely critical for what we might call isolated or islanded communities. And to the right, another likely effort we'll see with geothermal and even hydrogen delivery, marine hydrogen delivery, is Svalbard, the Norwegian island. They have geothermal on site. You'll likely also begin to see hydrogen deliveries coming off the coast of Norway, especially Finnmark, which is at the northernmost portion of Norway as it begins to touch the border with Finland. Lots of wind power opportunities and no wires, so to speak. So hydrogen deliveries become a really interesting opportunity, not only going south into Europe, but also northward to Svalbard to really get them off their diesel dependency. And there it is. And Steve, I am so sorry I didn't get my slides correct. I know you must be lovingly and professionally cursing me under your breath as we talk about this. But I think with Sarah, I'd love to have a conversation with a lot of this, the attendees here about long-term energy storage and the use of hydrogen as part of that.
Absolutely. And Keith, thank you very much for sharing more about hydrogen with us today. One question, I'll just start it off with Sarah to explore this geothermal hydrogen nexus a bit more. Is Fervo looking at hydrogen production at all in terms of an added value, or are you guys focused more on electricity generation at this point in time?
I would say at this point in time, we're hyper-focused on electricity generation. I think that hydrogen is a very high potential outlet for future energy storage, especially because we are trying to build projects in some hard to reach areas from a transmission perspective. So I think we're keen to watch how that market unfolds. But at this point in time, we're pretty focused on the front end, electricity and heat generation.
I'll also add, I think as we begin to see more long-term hydrogen energy projects, I think that really begins to attract investment. We already have at least one long-term hydrogen storage project in Texas by Air Liquide. I believe it can hold about 30 days worth of hydrogen that is typically produced by a traditional hydrogen production plant. And lots of salt caverns across the US. I think that's where hydrogen really becomes interesting. I mean, there's a lot of different methods of energy storage, but when you really want something well beyond a week's worth of storage, hydrogen, I think, becomes probably, at least at this time, from what I've seen, the best opportunity. But again, I think it's really going to be watching others prove it first before others begin to step in.
And we got this question, of course, because we are the Western governors, but I'll start with geothermal asking, and we got it for both energy sources. Sarah, what's the water footprint of some of these enhanced geothermal systems that you guys are using for battery storage? I know binary systems tend to be very efficient. What are you guys looking at in terms of water usage?
So we are looking at using binary cycle power plants. And so if you're operating in consistent generation mode, it's very similar to a traditional geothermal footprint. That said, I think because I think it's an important thing to note that in all of our projects, we are working on using gray water rather than fresh water. And because it's a traditional closed loop system, 100% of the water that we pull up and harvest heat from, we re-inject back into the earth, which is an important consideration in these dry Western United States. That said, if you are thinking about shutting off your production and injecting more water, you will need a water reserve. I actually don't have numbers on hand for me, but because we're looking at losing less water into the reservoir, we are hoping that it's a highly efficient process where we can sort of acquire the water, keep it on hand, inject it into the reservoir, and then as we discharge, regather it in a surface storage facility to be used the next time we want to recharge the system.
Wonderful. And Zach from our audience had a really great question, and he asked, why is in-storage reservoir storage or in reservoir storage compelling compared to equipping geothermal plants with batteries? So why is it more compelling to make these in-reservoir storage systems instead of just calling up Tesla and saying, hey, send us some batteries and we'll store some energy here?
I think there are two reasons right off the bat. And one is that calling Tesla would bring in 4-hour lithium storage batteries, which that adds no additional value to a geothermal power plant, because if you're just going to be storing a battery to discharge onto the grid in a 4-hour chunk of time, I think you would rather be able to store in reservoir for a 6-hour chunk of time or an 8-hour chunk of time. I think 4-hour batteries are going to be installed all over the place with solar and are not necessarily the most high value means of storage for a geothermal energy plant. I think number two, lithium ion batteries are going to require a huge number of materials. And I think when you're thinking about in-reservoir energy storage, which actually doesn't require any additional materials, your ultimate life cycle analysis impact is much lower on the environment. And so for us, if we can store for 4 hours in the reservoir without any additional materials, that's a much preferred way to go.
Now, William brought up an interesting question. How many megawatts of capacity per well and how many wells per pad? And I'm going to guess that's going to depend more on reservoir characterization. And I think his question is in regards to how many megawatts can you store?
How many megawatts can we store? I think at this point in time, we are looking at building, multi-megawatt wells, and then really trying to push the bounds of multi-pad drilling. And so that's something that has not been deployed at all in the geothermal energy industry to date, and is something that, we've drilled now multiple wells from a single pad and hope to be able to do that a bunch in the future to create, who knows, 50 megawatt single pad units, which would be huge for a land impact perspective. In terms of megawatts of storage, I actually don't have the megawatts of storage numbers on hand, but it should be on a similar realm. And it really is going to depend on, as we start to build these pads, what ends up happening from a spacing perspective.
And this one is for Patrick. Once again, since we're out in the West, hydrogen's going to get the water question. This one's for Keith. And Patrick asks, how would the availability of water impact future large-scale hydrogen generation?
I think as you begin to see, especially in mobility, hydrogen vehicles begin to replace gasoline vehicles and electric vehicles, there's a lot of water that's already being, I think, even much more used for petroleum refining. So one, you're beginning to see it's much less than that. I think you're going to be seeing a lot of efforts to recycle water. We're beginning to see that here in California. So I think those are some of the efforts that we're going to see, but certainly water is a key concern. I think there's been predictions done out of UC Irvine and even out of Europe about water usage. And I don't think it's concerned policymakers as much, but we do need to keep an eye on that. And certainly remember that hydrogen is produced from other sources as well, including biomass. And when it comes, and I noticed in one of the questions, someone's also talking about efficiency. The efficiency argument always comes up. I think it's also important to remember that it's not just about efficiency. It's also about utility, or what works. It's about productivity, and it's certainly about resiliency. Because when you want long-term energy storage, you can talk efficiency till you're blue in the face. But if you don't have a resource to do that, it doesn't matter. There are a lot of criteria that are used in even today when we look at a variety of examples. I mean, for example, in mobility, the efficiency argument is often used about drivetrains when you're comparing battery electrics to fuel cell electrics. But again, if your battery electric bus isn't performing well in the heat of the Las Vegas summer, efficiency certainly has its import. But again, those other criteria are often equally as important. So you always want efficiency. You always want continuous improvement. And certainly hydrogen and fuel cell related technologies exist in the same universe as batteries and others. But I think oftentimes that efficiency argument is used to ding hydrogen in a way that ultimately may not make sense.
And Keith, one of those efficiencies that's often talked about is how do we produce fuel sources, and what's the CO2 footprint or the carbon dioxide footprint of that? And I think that's why a lot of people are bringing up hydrogen production in reference to geothermal, because it creates this base load energy production, but also is a low carbon energy resource, if no carbon at all, if that. Is that a consideration that people who are producing hydrogen have to look at? Is what's our scope 2 of our energy production? And is that why we continue to hear geothermal as possibly being a good source for hydrogen production?
If you look at all of the policies around the globe, all the policies are driving us to either zero emission or low emission, which either, whether it's that includes like carbon capture. But if you look at the policies, like I said, the hydrogen production tax credit gives a really high return when it comes to renewables. You have policies across the West and around the globe. It's all about how do we get to the lowest possible carbon emissions for the production of hydrogen. And if you really look at, for example, the low carbon fuel standards across, when I was talking about California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, they're all aiming at zero carbon and low carbon hydrogen production. So everyone knows where the end game is. It's how do we get there? How do we get through this transition as quickly as possible? In some cases, some elements are going to be slower than others, but given the policies we've seen and the more they continue to stack on top of each other, it's a given. And geothermal, I think, is an ideal way of making hydrogen.
Wonderful. And we have a question from Amanda here, and she asks, what can you tell us about the research and development on splitting H2S for hydrogen production? While H2S is not high enough concentrations in most geothermal fields for it to be economically feasible as a standalone H2 generation tech, perhaps it makes sense when coupling with electrolysis for geothermal power generation plus geothermal heat. Now that's kind of a loaded question.
Yeah, I may not be the right guy to do this. I'm a highly non-tech. If it isn't already obvious, I'm a highly non-technical person.
Understood. No worries. No worries. And Sarah, we have a question for you from Matthew. If you are targeting less fractured reservoirs, do you know roughly what porosity is required to have a productive well? Is that necessarily higher restricting regions? Highly restrict regions for this style of development?
What was the second part of the question?
Does that necessarily restrict regions for this style of development?
Yeah, it's really low permeability. I mean, I think you can think of it like conventional oil and gas versus unconventional oil and gas. We're looking at unconventional geothermal systems with really, really small millidarcy permeability. I know you asked about porosity, but I think maybe we're talking about permeability. And so does it restrict? It's less about, going to the right permeability area, which is sort of the target in oil and gas, is to go find the permeability you can actually, use to extract the right amount of hydrocarbon. For us, it's much more about temperature at depth. And because we have developed this system, we can deal with a broader range of permeabilities than traditional geothermal. Now, we're not looking at really high permeability systems. So we're actually going away from those traditional hydrothermal systems. And lots of times what ends up happening is in a faulted regime, which are high permeability, you're finding really hot hydrothermal systems. So what we found is a really productive area around traditional hydrothermals that typically is much greater in just geographic square footage, from a geographic square footage perspective. So I think it's probably more opening than a traditional hydrothermal approach.
Wonderful. Well, at this point in time, I do want to be respectful of our participants' schedules. I just want to say thank you, Keith and Sarah, for joining us to talk about additional applications of geothermal energy sources and what they can be used for. I'd also like to take this opportunity to also once again recognize our sponsors for the Heat Beneath Our Feet. Without their contributions, our work on this initiative would not be possible. Thank you to everybody who joined us for today's webinar, and make sure to keep an eye out for the next Heat Beneath Our webinar. You guys have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, WGA.
Thank you.